Ready?
Yes, ready.
Okay. A warm welcome to those attending and also to our viewers watching live on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. This is a meeting of the Audit Committee. My name is John Chesshire and I'm the chairman of this meeting. Details of the business to be considered today is shown on the agenda, copies of which are accessible on YouTube underneath the broadcast. In terms of housekeeping, we're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow officers to the fire exits and out of the building to the designated meeting points. For those in the room, please switch any mobile devices to silent before the meeting starts. For those watching via YouTube, if you're so minded, you can complete one of our residents' feedback forms. These can be found in the information section underneath the YouTube video. These forms are intended to help us improve the way that we run our meetings. I'm going to move on to the attendees now. So, in terms of attendees, remind me, Anisha, do we go around the room and introduce ourselves, or?
If you prefer that, Chairman, yeah.
Okay, if I could just go to my right and we'll take the room round anti-clockwise to introduce ourselves.
Hello, I'm Councillor Nick Dennis.
Thank you. Councillor Rita Chumbell.
Councillor Tony Burrows.
I'm Helen Thompson. I'm the partner from Ernst & Young.
I'm Larissa. I'm the audit manager from Ernst & Young.
Stephanie Rayo, internal audit manager.
Alex Brown, Head of Council Fraud.
Andy Evans, Corporate Director of Finance.
James Lake, Head of Pensions, Treasury and Statutory Accounts.
Anisha Tedji, Democratic Services.
And John Chesshire, Chair of the Audit Committee. Thank you, everyone, for the introductions. I'm going to move to the agenda, and we'll move to agenda item 1 to begin with. Apologies for absence. Anisha.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Councillor Lewis and Councillor Abbey.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Agenda item 2 is declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest from members? No declarations of interest reported today. Thank you. Are in public. Thank you very much indeed. I know I'm going to misfire on the mic at some point, so there we go. I was just saying that all of our agenda items today are part 1, which means we'll be considering them in public in their entirety today. Agenda item 4 is minutes of the previous meeting. So, as usual, we'll look down, go through them page by page, and if there are any suggested amendments, please speak up. Page 1, I have a suggested amendment. I'm not a councillor, so we probably just need to correct that for the record. Page 2, page 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the minutes, Anisha. Agenda item 5 is the update on the external audit of the 2021-22 Statement of Accounts and the update of the external audit on the Pension Fund 21-22 accounts. James.
Thank you, Chair. This item provides committee with an update on the audit of the Council's accounts and the Pension Fund accounts. As noted previously, the statutory deadline for completion of the audit has been extended to November. However, we set an aspirational target of the end of September. This was always going to be aspirational and had an element of risk, and we haven't actually managed to sign off at the end of September. However, we are in a good position. We've done a lot of work, and compared to many local authorities, we are doing well. With that, I will pass over for EY for their observations.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. I'm not going to say an awful lot in terms of introduction. You've obviously got the 2 reports. We thought it would be helpful to provide you with something to consider in terms of the progress for both the Council and the Pension Fund. In fairness, the Pension Fund work is largely complete and it's going through the review processes. So in that sense, that is well progressed. In terms of the audit for the council, the audit is well progressed, other than the areas that we kind of probably highlight. And I would say for both the pension fund and for the council, one of the areas of work that we haven't done a lot on thus far is particularly around going concern, and that is now something that we will park until things settle down a little bit. That was really probably all I'd say. I think it'd be easier probably to take any questions that members might have.
Thank you very much, Helen, and yes, I appreciate the approach there, and appreciate the update as well. It was useful to see where we've got to with all of this. Colleagues, were there any particular questions that you had for EY as a result? Councillor Dennis.
I've got two, but they're unrelated. Do you want me to go one and let others
No, ask
okay.
both.
So, first one is just something I picked up on. Is it page 8 or under the value for money report, part of the report? Under reporting on value for money, it says we were not satisfied that the councillors made proper arrangements for securing economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in its use of resources. Now that sounds quite interesting to me. Could you explain exactly where that sort of opinion comes from, and just what's behind that statement?
I think it might be just a bit of a misunderstanding. I think, is it in the first paragraph under reporting on VFM that we're looking at?
Yeah.
So I think what we're saying here is that what we now do on value for money is we do an initial risk assessment to identify whether there are any significant risks of significant weakness in the arrangements that the council has in place, and then if we're not doing any further work, then we issue a commentary on the arrangements, which we include in the auditor's annual report. I think what we're trying to say here is where we are not satisfied that the council has made proper arrangements, there is still the same requirement that we refer to this in the audit report. So we're not drawing a conclusion. We're just kind of saying we're sort of saying this might be an outcome, but this is not the outcome. Does that make sense? So
if you were concerned.
If we were concerned. So how it used to be, stepping back a moment, under the previous code issued by the National Audit Office, we issued a value for money conclusion. So we concluded on whether the council had proper arrangements in place or not. However, we didn't really give any details behind that. And I can't remember which committee it was that we brought the auditor's annual report to, but there is now a much more detailed commentary on the arrangements that the council has in place, and that was the change that was made. So the wording changed, so we no longer give a value for money conclusion, we report by exception, and that's what this is trying to say, but possibly not that clearly.
It's just one of those phrases that sort of you pick up on, but that's interesting. Thank you. And my second question, I suppose, is when do you think the audit will be done? When am I going to have to book 3 days out of my diary and get lots of coffee?
This is the $1 million question, Councillor Dennis.
I would love to have a crystal ball and tell you that. We will continue to aim to complete the audit for the 30th of November. However, I think, as James mentions in the cover report, the national infrastructure issue is one that is not going to be easily resolved and possibly not quickly resolved. There are other areas of work that we're working on, in particular around the property, plant and equipment. And we've had discussions with James and Andy this afternoon about how we can move that whole piece of work forward. So that is a risk in itself. But the infrastructure assets issue is much broader, and I don't know if either Andy or somebody's brought you up to date on that, or if you would like our take on the update.
I think it would be interesting just to hear, fairly briefly, your view of what the likely timeline and outcomes are going to be.
So I think there are the position as things stand is that SIPFA is continuing to work on an adaptation to the Accounting Code of Practice, and they were hoping to provide that mid to late September. Well, we're now pretty much at the end of September. We haven't seen it, so I suspect that's slipped. there is a risk associated that they won't be able to come up with an adaptation to the code that would be acceptable to the wider accounting profession within public sector. So they have to put their proposal through a body called FRAB, the Financial Reporting Advisory Board, which effectively looks at how IFRS and accounting is carried out across the whole of the public sector. So CIPFA can't go down one route if the rest of the public sector is likely to go a different way. FRAB didn't like their original proposal, and that's why it was put back in May, June time. So if that comes out in October, if they can find a route that gets agreed through FRAB, then happy days. I suspect there are going to be challenges to that, and I think the profession generally thinks that that could be a challenge. An alternative route that is being considered is a statutory override, which the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities would put in place. Again, that was working to a similar timetable to CIPFA, but I suspect has been derailed, but firstly by Parliament being not sitting through the period of the mourning for the Queen, and then subsequently because there's quite a lot, obviously it's conference season, so they're not sitting, and there are some various other things going on that are possibly going to derail their timetable. So until we get those, we don't know what that solution would be. The alternative to waiting for a solution from either CIPFA or from DLUC would be to consider a qualification through a limitation of scope. But we've agreed with officers, and it's in line with almost all other councils, that it would be, given the deadline, and I don't like using the word statutory for audited accounts because it's not quite that, but given the deadline is the 30th of November, we might as well wait. So November is, I think, would be aspirational. I think it's, in all likelihood, it is likely it will go beyond that, but I don't know by how long, because it's part of the decision is out of our hands, and then it will be a discussion, firstly with officers, and then secondly, it should be with the audit committee about what do you want to do, and what decision do you want to make. I don't know, Andy, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. I think in terms of the timetable, the positive thing from my perspective is that we are working together closely. There's good communications between the two teams. There is, I think, on both sides underlying challenges around resources that we can apply, timings in some of the process, particularly around assets, which is a complex area. I would reassure the committee that this doesn't fundamentally impact on the accounts, the financial position of the council. It's quite a technical issue, and I know it's frustrating for myself and a lot of other professionals to see this sort of playing out in real time, but I think it's all done with the best of intentions, because the aim is to streamline, simplify the accounts, and you just had some training, so you're fully aware of how complex they are as a document. So that's what everybody is aiming for. It's just there's not quite that consensus on how we get there, and to make those accounts, I guess, more familiar, similar to what you see in the private sector. So that's the underlying aim to this. How you get there is quite a complex matter with different opinions playing into it, and obviously we're then caught in the middle. And there are some officers who are concerned about other priorities given the situation, and they just want to get through the process of external audit, get their accounts signed off. So they're taking the view, well, we'll accept the qualification. As Helen says, it's too early to say because this is still being debated. The statutory deadline is now the end of November, so we don't need to rush into anything. We've still got some other work to work through. So at the moment, I would just suggest there's nothing to be too worried about. There are, as I say, challenges on both sides in terms of resource, which is making it take a bit longer than it might do. But we are making progress. There's a lot of positive. There's a lot of work that we've got through in the meantime. So that's, I think, where we are.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you very much, Helen. Councillor Bells.
So just a quick question. I think I know the answer, but just record. Is there any cost implications with the accounts not being signed off till November to EY or to the council?
Not directly, no. So there's no sort of fine in place for not achieving the deadlines, which is different. Obviously, if you're working in a corporate world, there are fines imposed for certain audits not completing on time. The cost comes from the additional work that might be required, and in part for infrastructure. One of the reasons for pausing on that is that we could start to go down a route of doing a lot of work that might become unnecessary, for example. So we're trying to sort of minimise the additional costs by taking that approach. If I took it slightly, so it's the cost of time rather than a financial cost. Obviously, that's still a financial cost, but it's more a time than.
I've got one question, if I may. I'm putting aside the infrastructure assets issue. Having read through the update and heard from you, the only other sort of, I'll use the phrase sticking point, or the area which is going to require a little bit more work, is around valuations. That's been a traditional area where we've had toings and froings in the past, coupled with resource issues, both on finance side and on your side. To what extent, are you feeling more comfortable this year compared to last year, both about the valuations and about the resourcing?
It's a very good question, and if I were to answer it absolutely honestly, I'm perhaps a little bit less comfortable this year. Last year I wasn't comfortable because I was new to the council, new to picking up the audit, and there were some challenges that way. This year I think there's certainly been turnover within the estates team, if I'm using the right terminology for Hillingdon, which I think has caused some challenges in terms of being able to provide us with the information. So at this stage, the conversation that we had this afternoon was where we've been for the last few months, has been 6 to 8 weeks, has been you'll get the information. We'll be able to give you the information by the end of the week, or by the end of the end of the week each week type thing. And I think the conversation I had with Andy and James this afternoon is, let's step back, recognise that there are pressures on everybody with the amount of work that needs to be done. So whilst audit is our priority, it's not necessarily the priority for everybody else, and they're probably being pulled from pillar to post. Can we just try and get I've lost the word in my head, a realistic timetable for when the council can provide the baseline information that we've been after, to be able to then book in our resources at EYRE and then book in our own resources to get that. And it's just the fact that that's the bit that then becomes a bit more of a resource challenge. I will be honest that by the fact that it's kind of gone out by almost 2 months probably, does knock on into when will we be able to bring people back in. And I know, sadly, my colleagues in valuations, the EYRE team, are still very under pressure, and then if the corporate busy season starts to kick in as well, then we're going to hit further challenges. So I'm hoping, and I know Andy's agreed, that we'll take some steps next week to try and put that plan in place, rather than having multiple conversations about why haven't we got it yet. Let's sort of say, actually, if it's going to take 3 weeks, 4 weeks, I'd rather know it's going to take 3-4 weeks, then we can start to plan from that. So I think that's where we're at. Again, Andy, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think most of that is fair. It's also, I think now we're a lot clearer on what that information needs to look like, some of the details around it, which in our initial tranche were not quite there. It's been an area that comes up, I think, for certainly the last few years, and I think I'm correct in saying it's also an area that's under review, that Treasury have asked for a detailed review. So there's a piece of work undergoing on how we account for that whole area of PPE, non-investment assets, because it's a really complicated area. And again, it comes down to what's the value of the audit work that we're doing, what does it actually achieve. I think they're hopeful that the outputs of that review will go into the 22-23. Again, that might be a bit optimistic, but hopefully, as we say, over the next 1 to 2 years, we'll start to see some improvements in that area, some clarity about what the audit needs to cover, and just as importantly, what it doesn't need to cover.
Thank you for that, and thank you again both for the answers. For the record, Councillor Lewis, slightly delayed. Good afternoon. No trouble at all. No problem. Any other final questions for where we are? Okay. Appreciate the update as ever. Thank you very much indeed for the work done on the statement of accounts and on the pension fund accounts. And good luck. Obviously, over I hope the next few weeks go well and smoothly for the finance team and for yourselves. So, thank you for the update. We'll now turn to agenda item 6, which is the 21-22 annual risk management report. Stephanie.
Thank you, Chair. So this report, obviously from page 25 of the pack, presents to Audit Committee the Risk Management Annual Report for the previous financial year of 2021-22. And so if you turn over leaf to the beginning of the report, it kind of goes through the purpose of risk management and the framework and the role of the risk management within the organisation. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is, obviously, from page 29, section 4, the embedding of effective risk management. This is the embedding of the risk management work undertaken in 21-22. You'll note, obviously, there's some embedded things you may have seen before in terms of the service and financial planning. However, I draw your attention to, obviously, section 4.3, which is the dedicated schools grant. Oh,
sorry, Stephanie. Yeah. Maybe you could just speak up a little. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'll go back to the beginning. So the annual risk management report is the work undertaken in 2021-22, so the previous financial year. The first couple of sections refer to the role of risk management and basically the purpose of risk management and in the organisation. What I'd like to draw your attention to is section 4, which is embedding effective risk management in 21-22. There are some elements that you may have seen in there before in terms of service financial planning. You'll notice the embedding of risk management specifically to dedicated schools grant and the work undertaken in terms of the safety valve arrangements that are in place. If you draw your attention to section 5, which is the corporate risk register process and the directorate risk register process. This is much very similar to the previous year. However, 5.6 details the analysis of the corporate risk register, which shows you the movement on a quarterly basis, whether they've deteriorated, improved, or remained static or retired. Section 6 are the other risk management developments, and obviously this references the changes in the organisation during the year, which in terms of the senior management structure, which could obviously then relate to segregation of duties, etc., and other impacts on risk management. Lastly, I'd like to draw your attention to the emerging risk section. This is in conjunction with horizon scanning, working with our senior managers during our risk discussions on a quarterly basis, looking at the KPIs and identifiers in their relevant services. So in terms of governments could be left with higher debts, obviously following the pressure following the COVID pandemic. Inflation, you'll notice in the next item we talk about inflation, but obviously it's talking about the contributors of the rising energy prices, which then also leads onto a cost of living crisis, and then impacts on the recruitment and retention. And lastly, the high demand for housing and social care in our organisation. Actually, it's macro, so these aren't just obviously localised to Hillingdon. After which you've got the appendices, which goes through the process map, and you also have a snapshot of the summary of the directorate risk registers as at Q4. So you may notice some of the risk entries, but obviously the direction of travel may have changed since then. And you might notice obviously that we already had on our finance directorate risk register the inflation risk at Q4, which you'll see later on. I'd like to invite any questions. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate the overview. I'm going to turn to my colleagues on the committee first. Were there any particular questions? Councillor Dennis.
At the moment, I always have questions. Just two questions. One, possibly superficial. What's a risk champion do? Sounds quite exciting, but I just saw a list of names saying they're risk champions.
Well, I would say they are. It is an exciting role. So it's part of our statutory risk management programme of work. We have an overview of these champions have overviews of their directorate risk register. We hold corporate risk management group, and the risk champions are representatives from their directorate. So obviously, although we do meet with the relevant SMTs and CMT, they're there to kind of help embed risk management within their directorate, and also at CRMG have overview not just of their own particular service but of the directorate. So then if there are any challenges or queries, they can then take it back to their own directorate themselves and take a lead on that.
My second question is possibly slightly related. I just want to understand what happens when a significant risk is identified. So, for example, if I look at page 40 under the Financial Directorate Risk Register, you have in the significant and large cross-section, you have fuel and inflation, and we can understand probably why that's there. But what happens in that sort of situation is so obviously we've identified those two things as being significant, i.e. it's happening, and large, it could have a big effect. So what's the process then in terms of, do we sort of just accept that, or do we then put in mitigations to try and move it down or across?
That's a good question. So if you actually skip ahead to page 59 of your packs, it's actually got the risk score methodology of how we've quantified that risk in terms of likelihood and impact. So I'll wait for you to have a look at that one. One sec. Yep. So obviously, depending on how we've arrived at the risk scoring, it could be actually due to the threat under the service provision or financial, health and safety, or not meeting our objectives. So however we've addressed that, we've identified the risk, and we can tolerate it, but or transfer it, or treat or terminate, but most of the time it ends up being treating, where we're actually listing on the risk entries activities we're undertaking or have undertaken already to help mitigate that risk. Now, the likelihood is there could always be a residual risk, and that we might have to accept that, but obviously the work that we can undertake can actually improve the risk rating. It depends on what it is. It can vary it. For example, COVID, a widespread risk, there's nothing we could do to actually stop COVID, but we could actually prevent the spread locally and the infrastructure and support the national initiatives. So there's a mixture of things, and so it might be that this is what it is. We have to accept it. If we were fighting a legal challenge, and our position statement would have to change as such, you'll notice on the risk register entries we have the council's statement underneath. So if the likelihood is that we're not going to win it, it might be that we aren't going to win it, but we'll do all the remedial action that we can to minimise the impact. So it depends on the risk, to be honest. But the process, it's embedded in our risk discussions. We have quarterly risk discussions with risk owners, SMTs, which is a wider discussion as well. It's tied in with our internal audit planning process as well. So you'll find that risk leads on to, okay, well, do you want to provide assurance in this particular area? We can then support providing an assurance for you to actually pinpoint what our findings are, and to then obviously funnel through any improvement work that needs to be undertaken. With the risk entries, we do have discussions at SMTs. Well, this is deteriorating. Should this now be escalated to the corporate risk register? And obviously, in the next item, you might see an example of that. But we do escalate, and we do de-escalate as well. For example, you'll notice the Brexit risk. At once upon a time, it was on our corporate, and now it's been retired. So you will see that movement. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, essentially, this activity means people can't hide from risk, no matter what they decide to do with that. Good, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
That's better. I can hardly criticise you for talking quietly and then fail to turn on my microphone. We've, in part of my commercial world, have moved on from just risk management, and we've moved on to scenario planning. Do we do anything where we develop scenarios, which is that we take it to the nth degree? We sit down for days sometimes and plan for all of our risks and see if there are any colliding points, and then we can actually action for more than one risk by mitigating the common risks that within that. I'm not explaining it very well, but some of my colleagues would explain it much better.
So there's two different elements of that. So we do obviously discuss and talk about synergies, and obviously not undertaking actions, preventive actions and mitigating actions in silo or, in isolation. For example, financial risks, it could be inflation, balanced budget, things like that. There are a lot of similarities, and obviously the discussions are had. However, in terms of plotting out, in terms of risks, it's dependent on the risk, to be honest, because we do facilitate it, but it's actually the risk owner is there to obviously assess and undertake any action that they believe would be supportive in actually helping to plan out and prevent any risk materialising if they can do so. For example, when it comes to something like social care providers due to not being able to provide a service due to technical failure or something like that, going off on a tangent slightly, we have business continuity and emergency management response, and they do undertake exercises where they look at potential risky areas, and it could be from the Directorate Risk Registers, and they play out the scenario as such, and then they activate, or in theory activate, their business continuity plans. Now, their business continuity plans are also meant to be aligned to their objectives and their risks and their key services they need to deliver, and this is all intertwined. So there potentially in some places could be a stronger link between these, but they are intertwined in certain places.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bells.
Thank you. Just quite interested in look at page 39. The fire safety has been retired as a risk.
Don't worry.
Right.
It's been replaced with building safety. It's obviously following Grenfell, but I believe, without looking at the detail in the Directorate Risk Register, there were changes to the building regulations, not just for fire safety, but this encompassed that, making sure that we were aligned, following the I can't think of the name now. Apologies, the name escapes me. There was a review that was undertaken, which was caused by that, and basically that was undertaken, and following which some of the findings there were then to make some reforms to the building regulations, and so most of it is to do with fire, but it's to make sure we encompass all of that. Part of one of the requirements was to make sure that we have a responsible officer in local authorities, and it wasn't just to do with making sure our stock doesn't have cladding and making sure we have fire safety doors. It also has a planning element as well, so it's encompassing, and also a bit more about housing tenancy management. So it has various different work streams, and this risk is to make sure that we encompass all of that correctly in line with the legislation to make sure we're compliant.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of observations and a couple of questions, if I may. Page 29, this section 4 on embedding effective risk management. I think there's been some good progress in some of these areas this year, and I just wanted to highlight the safety valve agreement on the dedicated schools grant. The DSG has obviously been an area of concern for us as a committee in the past, and that feels like a really good piece of news in that area. Is that fair?
I think it's fair to say. There was a lot of hard work that went into that with senior officers and officers in finance and SEN, etc. It's linked to various other commitments and work streams that are being undertaken, so there was a lot of people involved in making sure that was achieved.
Okay, very pleased to see that, because it has been something that has exercised us previously. Moving on, the Section 6, page 32, on the other risk management developments, I thought this was a really good, clear piece of reporting. I thought it flowed well. I thought it painted a good picture of some of the issues that we saw during last year. Some maybe opportunities, some threats a little bit. But I did value that section, very, very highly as an important part of the annual report. So thank you for that. Page 34 on the forward plan. We have different continuums to assess how mature an organisation's risk management framework and practices are, and you've assessed the council's position as risk defined, a sort of level 2 out of 5, if you will, in terms of maturity. We've been level 2 for a number of years now. I think I've been the chair now for nearly 5 years, and it's always been risk defined. Is it realistic to want to move to the next level, and is it just something that is slow and difficult to move step by step further?
I think it was a real ambition to go to the next stage, and it was what we were working on. However, it's kind of that kind of work has got kind of warped along the way with COVID, and I think the main issue now isn't really COVID. It's to do with, if you refer to paragraph 6.1, to do with the new appointments and governance arrangements, and then obviously following on from that, 6.4, the business transformation. It's almost that you need to have these core elements established, and then look at your appetite as to how we're going to move forward with this. It's a new environment. We need to shake things up a bit and not stick to the original plan regardless. And we are in terms of where we are as risk defined, we do have very experienced officers who have risk management embedded in their day-to-day duties, but it's how we move to the next stage, where it's not necessarily another stage of risk registers. It's, are there compensating controls? How is risk embedded in daily duties and assessed? And you're looking at thresholds, you're looking at decision making, strategic decisions. So it's really about, once we've got the transformation work underway, where there might be some really big changes to services, there might not be. It's how do we look at how we move forward from there on in. So it's really like a transitional phase at the minute.
Okay, I think that's very fair. It's about sort of getting it really embedded in the culture more than anything. Andy?
Yeah, I just want to add to that, because I think it's a really good question about where we go with this process, because it's I would say it's fundamentally sound. I think it does what it needs to do in terms of highlighting the key risks. Having come closer to it since taking this role, we've got good involvement from service areas in the process, in our corporate risk management group, and a fairly comprehensive view of the risks across the council. But again, I think it's a good time to take a fresh look, given the environment in which we find ourselves at the moment. And as you know, we're rebuilding the internal audit function. We're in the process of recruiting a head of internal audit. So I think it's a good time to take a look at our approach. Someone with a fresh pair of eyes coming in from another organisation might have some ideas we can use to enhance our current process, and perhaps make it a little bit more real-time, a bit live, given, as I say, the environment we find ourselves in. So I think that's our direction of travel. I think it's a fundamentally sound approach we've got, but again, I think we should take another look at it, because you can always improve. And I wouldn't get too caught up on benchmarking tools. It really is, how useful is the process to the organisation, and in terms of identifying and then managing risk. I think that's the key outcome we're after.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed. And I did enjoy reading Section 8, of course, the sort of crystal ball section. And we live in volatile times, and volatility brings uncertainty, and that brings risk. So I can look at each of those sections that you've included within the report and think, yeah, that feels, about right to me, and I can't think of anything sort of that is missing in terms of the headlines as at the time of the report. I do have just one sort of other general, two general questions. On section 8.4, you highlight recruitment and retention. We've heard about resourcing issues within finance, and I'm sure there are resourcing issues in other service areas across the council at the present time. If I then look at the Central Services Directorate Risk Register on page 38, I see retention as significant likelihood, but a small sort of impact. That's not the sense I'm getting.
They've been reviewed since then, and it might be a different position.
Maybe it's changed.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll watch that space, but that feels like an obvious area of concern to me, in general. And the final question I have, you'll be pleased to know, is that, and it's absolutely a genuine question, where's the risk of fraud to the council in all of this? I can't see it in any of the directorate risk registers, and if I'm looking at the materiality scores that you pointed us to on page 59, financial loss to the council would fit, in the 2 million, 4 million bracket based upon the results of our fraud colleagues' work. So where's fraud risk?
Yeah, you can take it.
It's a very good question, Chairman. So I know this has been brought up before, and it was more surrounding the fraud risk register is kept as a separate entity from the corporate risk register. So I hold a fraud risk register for the whole organisation, and it's tabbed by directorate and by service. And funny enough, I've been reviewing it in the last 6 weeks, so it's up to date. So it's never actually appeared on the corporate risk register itself. It's always been like a separate entity, and obviously I present an updated fraud risk assessment every April to yourselves.
Obviously I knew that, but forgot completely. Okay, thank you for the reminder on that. I'd forgotten completely. I was just looking at the directorates as we were talking. I was saying, where's fraud in all of this? That answers the question perfectly. Thank you all very much indeed. Now, Councillor Lewis.
I was just going to ask about the risk of strikes as we have inflation and wages obviously cannot keep up with the cost of living. So do we actually factor that in anyway?
To be honest, I haven't initially directly thought about the risk of strikes, if I'm honest. Obviously, we've looked at the resilience and worrying about infrastructure. If, for example, if care homes were unable to function, whether it be due to strike or lack of workers, or for example as well, things like building capital programs, or if they can actually get things from A to B when they need it to be, whether what the cause is, what is your contingency and how will you cope with that. But I know when we look at the inflation risk that's recently on the next item, there's different elements to that, how it's going to affect the council and also how it's going to affect residents, and maybe it's something that we can expand upon as the risk develops, obviously when we bring it back to the next audit committee in November.
Thank you. Andy.
Just one small point, I think it's quite a good question you've asked there, but Unison have agreed the pay deal this week, which reduces that risk, as I say, at this point. I don't think they ever got to the point of a strike ballot, but again, we're going back to Q1 here, but yeah, it's a good point, and I guess it's implied within the inflation risk, if not explicit within the narrative there.
Thank you for the clarification. Any final questions, colleagues? No? Well, only to thank you again for an informative and well laid out, well structured report. Thank you very much, Stephanie. Brings us to agenda item 7, which is sort of the up-to-date view, certainly as far as the end of quarter 1, 22-23 corporate risk register report. Stephanie.
Thank you. So again, this is the quarter 1 as at the 30th of June. Obviously, work will be underway to ensure the next audit committee you receive quarter 2. So since then, since quarter 4, the main changes were structural in terms of risk 2, meeting housing needs, the risk of not meeting housing needs in LBH, the risk going to move from Perry Scott to Mark Billings. Risk 3, the cause has been updated to include the impact of the detention centre placed in the borough to disperse asylum seekers to Rwanda. Litigation claims, the risk of litigation claims across the council, so the risk owner changed from your lorry to myself. Again, the ability to deliver a balanced budget in the medium term. Also, the two subsequent risks of financial resilience of contracts and dedicated schools grants changed from, the risk owner changed from Paul Wayman to Andy Evans in line with structural changes. Aside from, obviously, when you see that a risk remains static in the summary or in the detailed risk register, when we looked at the risk scoring methodology, it may be that there's been a slight improvement or decline, but obviously when we try to quantify it in terms of the risk scoring, it might not be material enough to move to the next threshold. So please bear that in mind. And you'll see there's a new risk, which is risk 12, inflation. And it's to do with the high levels of inflation that impacting, like we said, both the council services and its residents. And what we've seen as well across the directorate risk registers are all the kind of impacts of inflation on various other existing risks, which exacerbate existing risk entries. And before I hand over to questions, I just want to kind of draw your attention to your previous comment, Councillor Lewis, about the consideration of other flu epidemics and things like that. So that has been considered. There's not much change on the Q1 risk entry for COVID and coronavirus, but work is underway in social care to look into these, scope them out, address them, in line with also winter pressures that obviously are every year, but obviously with the combination of that and maybe some weakened immune systems and maybe other strains of COVID potentially. So they're scoping it all out at present, and hopefully we'll have a redrafted update, refreshed update for you for Q2.
Thank you very much. Councillor Lewis.
I mean, on that point, we have 4 variants at the moment which are a concern, and we are seeing a massive increase in flu. So it's almost certainly we will start seeing co-infections rising as the weather has got colder and people are coming indoors and mixing like you've never known before. So we will see co-infections.
Thank you. On that happy note. Thank you, Cassandra. Colleagues, any other questions or observations for Stephanie or colleagues about the content of this report? Okay. Just one quick question from me. I can see the importance of including inflation on there. I'm pleased to see, sort of pleased, inverted commas, to see that appear on the register. I'll go back to the observation about the dedicated schools grant, and I take on board the point you made about changes may not be sufficient to influence the score that we see, and then the location of the risk on the chart in front of us. But with that work done that we spoke about just a few minutes ago, are we still sort of confident that that's where the DSG risk sits on the chart at the present time? And I am looking towards Andy. I think this is one that you own, Andy.
Thanks, Chair. It's a good question. I think at the moment that's probably where it sits. I mean, the advantage of being in the safety valve process is, well, I'm saying it's advantage. It's quite a lot of work. We have a quarterly monitoring process direct to the DFE, but what that does enable us to do is to highlight any challenges and issues, which, of course, there are emerging as part of the wider inflationary pressures across both our capital plans and the cost of running schools and the DSG itself. So we've started to highlight some of those issues, how it might add to the risk of delivery around some of the key conditions within the safety valve. At the moment, most of those conditions are pretty much on target and progressing well. So I think that's a fair evaluation of the risk level as it currently stands. I mean, the overlying context is that the SAN reforms haven't yet been implemented, so there is still change to happen in that area which will deal with the underlying issue which is driving the pressure in there. But we are, as I say, fortunate in having got into the safety valve agreement in second tranche ahead of what's happening now, where there's much less resource available to those authorities that are now starting their discussions with the DFE. So as I say, we do have that direct line as part of the monitoring process that enables us to flag those risks and pressures as they emerge.
No, that makes good sense, and communication's very important. If we've got an avenue that's a little bit more regular, that can only help, I guess. Thank you for that. I don't see that we have any more questions. Again, thank you for the update. It'd be interesting to see what's in the next quarterly update on the risk front. Thank you very much for that briefing. Which brings us to the end of the agenda with agenda item 8, the work programme. Anisha.
Thank you, Chairman. Members are asked to consider the work programme, which details the upcoming meetings and the reports due. Thank you.
Okay, I don't know that there are any observations or questions. Apart from, of course, Helen.
I don't do it deliberately.
Don't worry.
I suppose it's just to reflect on the discussion that we had in relation to the question, the crystal ball question that I was asked, that somewhere, maybe November, maybe January, there will be the financial statements and the auditors, whatever we call it, audit results report. But the auditor's annual report for 21-22 will not be in November. So I don't know how you want to reflect that in the programme, but it's more just to make that observation.
We'll get that amended, and also I think we had, from memory, we had a private meeting last time, didn't we? Yeah, so I think we moved it around a little bit, so we might want to swap out, give you the freedom of not seeing us again in a private meeting, and perhaps replace it with one of our other colleagues as well, because we did meet last time. Okay. Thank you very much then. That concludes the business for this afternoon. Thank you all for the reporting and for the hard work, and much appreciated for your candid and clear answers. Good evening.